Hi everybody, and welcome to a symposium, a Signum Symposium with Dr. Holly Ordway. And I'm delighted to introduce you to her. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have heard about this wonderful new book that she's just had published that is setting the Tolkien scholarly world aflame. And it is righting some wrongs, I think. There it is, Tolkien's modern reading. It is righting some wrongs in the way in which people, many of us, have assumed Tolkien's library and past reading to be. So I'm really excited to talk to her today. So welcome, Holly.
Well, thank you for having me on. This is just a real pleasure to be here with you.
Great, good. So let's get cracking straight away with some questions. But audience, don't feel like all you've got to do there is sit there with the beverage of your choice, with your feet up, eating bonbons. You too should be joining in. So please feel free to put questions in the question box, and our very own Dr. Gabriel Schenk will be handling all of those questions as we go along. So keep them coming, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can. Right then, Holly. So first of all, let's start with a really nice big general question. And let me ask you about your connection to Tolkien in general. What is it that drew you to Tolkien's work in the first place? And when did you start reading him?
Well, this is a big question because Tolkien has been really a part of my imaginative life for pretty much as long as I can remember. In fact, I don't remember when I first read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings because I only remember rereading them. So I encountered them relatively early on, loved them, and they just became part of my sort of childhood's imaginative furniture. Along Chronicles of Narnia and Hobbit, Lord of the Rings were just really important books for me as a girl. It introduced me into the whole genre of fantasy, which I loved, which I got into. So I've kind of grown up in Middle Earth in a sense. And then when I was a teenager, I think I must have been early teenager, I came across a copy of Tolkien's On Fairy Stories and read it. And that completely rocked my world because it introduced me to literary criticism. It was really my first glimpse of what would turn out to be, little did I know it, my future career. Because here we have this author whom I loved writing about a genre that I loved, but helping me think about it as writing, which I had not done before. I had enjoyed it, but I hadn't thought about how it worked. And here is Tolkien in this magnificent essay, tremendously complex essay, where he's unpacking how does fantasy work, and yet he's doing it in a way that doesn't pull it apart, doesn't murder it to dissect. It makes it more engaging, more lively, more fascinating. And so I can fairly say that Tolkien made me a literary critic. And I've been thinking seriously about that essay for now more than 30 years, just having it help me think about the way that literature works, the way that fantasy works, the way the imagination works. So it really was almost inevitable that when I did my dissertation, I did it in fantasy literature, had Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as kind of the pivot point and his essay as sort of my framework. And then that exploration got me thinking a lot about the earlier fantasy scene, the pre-Tolkienian fantasy scene, because I wanted to see how he was set in that history. And then 10 years after that, it got me starting to think, I wonder what Tolkien had read of this earlier fantasy scene. What had he read of modern literature? Nobody seems to really think he read much. I wonder if he read any of these. I think I'll find out. That was 10 years ago, and here we are today.
Which actually leads me beautifully into my next question, because I wanted to immediately go into talking about this book. So if you can, tell us a little bit about writing this book. How did you start? I can get now what made you want to research this, because you just explained that to us. But it sounds to me like, because you just said, has anybody written about this? No, nobody's really written about this. How do you start with something, for our audience, how do you start with something that nobody has really addressed before? Where do you go? What do you do?
Well, really, the first thing was just asking questions, asking the right questions, because what really got me was thinking about this was first the question of, well, what of the early fantasy authors like Morris and Lord Dunsany had Tolkien read? Because I knew they were significant and knew they were the right era. So that was, okay, I can check up on that. But kind of the larger framing question for me also was, how do we make sense of The Lord of the Rings? Because The Lord of the Rings has been such a, incredibly important book for me personally, and as a literary critic, and you can just see how tremendously popular and engaging and not just popular, but in a kind of transformative way. It gives people insight into the way that the world works. It gives them insight into their own selves. It's an amazingly rich and powerful book. But if you were to step back, as some of the early, hostile critics did, oh, it's about a bunch of, elves and dwarves and a magic ring. Like, if you look at it that way, superficially, like, well, this doesn't seem to be really particularly relevant to the modern era and our modern issues. And yet it is.
Mm-hmm.
And that bothered me because I knew, obviously, that Tolkien is a medievalist, and that almost put me on a different career track, because I started my master's degree in medieval literature inspired by Tolkien, because I wanted to be a medievalist like him. And I started out, and then I decided that wasn't the direction that I wanted to go in. I wanted to do modern literature. But from the beginning, I've been very aware that Tolkien is a medievalist. He's deeply rooted in medieval literature, of course, and then the linguistic issues, of course. But I found that was inadequate to explain the power of The Lord of the Rings, because I enjoyed reading things like Beowulf. But let me tell you, people don't take Beowulf to the beach, Like, it's just, medieval literature has its enduring appeal. I've taught medieval literature, it's wonderful stuff, but it's not having the effect, it's not resonating the way that The Lord of the Rings does. So I just found myself saying, how do we explain this? How do we explain Tolkien's enduring relevance and power? So that was kind of my backdrop issue. And then the more immediate issue was, did you know any of these folks? And so I started my research with the essay that I knew best, which was on fairy stories, and looked at what he had mentioned in that essay, aided by the fact that Verlyn Flieger and Douglas Anderson had brought out this amazing edition of the drafts of On Fairy Stories, which has more material. And I got pretty easily about a couple dozen titles from looking at this. And I distinctly remember this point in my research thinking, wow, I've got something like 24 or 25 modern authors that he knew. Wow, that's a lot. And I end up with 140 odd authors, 200 odd titles. But I remember feeling quite pleased, like I have some substance here when I hit 25. And then that started me thinking, well, if he knew these, he clearly is reading amongst modern literature. What else did he read? And that led me to just scrutinize everything I could get my hands on, interviews that he had done, his letters, interviews with his friends, his family, his colleagues, his students, looking at articles, things that he'd given interviews for, looking at audio interviews, going to different archives, even things like, I went to the Oxford Union Library archives and looked at the librarian suggestion books to see had he written any, requests for book titles in those books. Turns out he hadn't. Oh well. But he was a member of the Oxford Union Library as an undergraduate. Even like getting a photograph of him in his study and getting a high resolution picture and looking at the spines. I was in fact able to find a few more titles that, as far as I know, nobody had mentioned before by literally looking at the books on his shelf in a high res picture. So just
as people are now doing with people on Zoom, and they're looking at the bookcases behind them.
Exactly. Nobody apparently had done that before. And just getting this mass of information, looking at references in his published writings, in his drafts, and just seeing where had he mentioned an author, where had he shown that he knew an author, and discovering that there was just an enormous mass of material that I completely did not expect. And then I had to figure out, what does this all mean? And one of the decisions I had to make as I got so much material was to make the dividing line that this was only going to be about books that I could give evidence that he had actually read or owned or that he knew. Because there's a real temptation in Tolkien scholarship to talk about possible parallels and things that he might have read or probably read, or etc. And you can do some good work with those kinds of things if you're really clear about what you're doing. But there's been a kind of muddiness where people will say, oh, well, he must have, he drew a source from this without being able to show that he had in fact read it. So one of the things that I resolved to do was not to discuss any author for whom I did not have evidence that Tolkien read. And it meant that a lot of stuff went on the cutting room floor that was pretty interesting. But nope, I'm not going to do that, because I think that there's plenty of material and then some as it is.
Yes, absolutely. I'm interested in what you were just saying there about loads of things hitting the cutting room floor, actually, because I did wonder, the things that you're saying you cut because you didn't have proof for it. For the things that you did have proof for, was there anything that had to hit the cutting room floor anyway, that kind of kill your darlings thing that you had to cut for space?
Well, I couldn't talk about all the things at the length that I necessarily wanted to talk about them, but every book or author whom I found evidence for reading is in the book, because I wanted it to be comprehensive. So some of them only have a half sentence and a footnote, but they're there, and so somebody else can look at that half sentence, follow the end note, look it up, and off they go. But all of the authors whom I identified as what I called certains are in. The ones that hit the cutting room floor were the probables. For instance, I think there's a good case to be made that he had probably read Chesterton's play Magic, but I couldn't tell that he had. Arguably, could I have argued that he read it because he read other Chesterton? I could possibly have done that, but I had so much other material that I knew that he had read. Or with John Buchan. And I know this might surprise some people, because Buchan is one of the authors who's gotten the most attention, because he's the only author that Humphrey Carpenter really is willing to name as a modern author that Tolkien read. So ironically, there's loads and loads of scholarship essays and things on possible influences from Buchan, but without anybody up until now identifying any specific title of Buchan's. And Buchan wrote loads of books. So we know he read Buchan, but when we talk about, say, Midwinter or something like that, did he read that one? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. One of the things that I'm pleased with is I was able to actually show that he had read Greenmantle, that there's a reference in one of his review essays that I think proves it, which we hadn't had that before. So now we know he definitely read Greenmantle. So I talk about Greenmantle and slightly by association the other Richard Hannay books, because it's part of that series. But I don't talk about any of the other Buchan books, even though there's all these interesting thematic parallels, because I don't know that he read them. And then the prime example that I actually put in as an example of who I'm not talking about is John Henry Newman. Because it is inconceivable to me that Tolkien, who grew up in Newman's oratory, it's inconceivable that he hadn't read Newman's works. But as yet, I have not been able to find evidence that he did. I have found evidence. I actually went up to Durham Palace Green Library, and I found evidence in the Newman Association archives that Tolkien was, in fact, quite heavily involved with the National Newman Association over a number of years. There had been a small connection noted by Douglas Anderson, which I then followed up and found out that it was quite a lot more than that one little connection had indicated. So that's new. I'm very pleased to discover that. But I still don't know any particular titles. So Newman in the book stands for all the authors that as yet, he almost surely he read them, but we don't know yet. So we need to treat them differently than the actual certains.
Really interesting, thank you. So Gabriel, have we got any questions coming in from the audience?
No questions from the audience yet. So just a reminder to everyone, this is an interactive session. There is a questions box in the the bottom right corner of your screen. So click on that, type out your question as soon as you think of it. And as if by magic, someone has two people have asked excellent questions that have just come in. Yay. So thank you very much. Yes, and Constantine says, may I ask a question here? Yes, please do. Just type out those questions in that box, and I will ask them for you. So Coley says, how do you see Tolkien's medievalism intersecting with his modern reading in his writing?
Oh, that's such a marvelous question. What I end up seeing was that Tolkien, a good image for Tolkien is as a translator or as a bridge, because his medieval work is so significant. And that's something I think it's worth emphasizing. I'm trying to do a corrective to some views of Tolkien that have dismissed his modern reading, but I'm not trying to go the other extreme, because his medieval reading, his medieval work is hugely important. It's just enormously important. It's undoubtedly more important than his modern reading. It's really significant, but it's not the whole story. And so what I found is that he's able to use the material from his medieval reading and make it powerful and relevant precisely because of his rooting in the modern world. And I was quite struck by an interview with one of his students who was talking about Tolkien's teaching of Beowulf, and he describes Tolkien as a translator who's able to make the world of Beowulf come to life for the modern students. And I think that's really the same thing he's doing with all of his medieval reading and all of his modern reading, because he might know the medieval world better than anybody else, and he probably did. But if it was just that, he would stay locked up in his world of the past, and he wouldn't be able to share it with anybody. In order to share it, he has to understand the language of the people he's teaching, that he's writing to. So in effect, he has to be bilingual, both medieval and modern, in order to communicate the medieval to the modern. And I think that's an aspect of his gift as a medievalist that has been maybe not as explored as it could have been, or it's been hinted at, but without seeing how much he's drawing from his modern engagement. I think it's his reading of modern literature, it's his engagement with modern culture, more broadly speaking, with the news, things like that, that he's able to really assimilate what are the modern concerns, what does he want to critique, what does he want to push back against, how does he want to respond, and then he has all the resources of his medieval insights, his medieval treasury to call on for images, for archetypes, for language, for all sorts of things. And it's that image of translator that, to me, or bridge, that really resonates at this point.
And of course, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are supposed to be translations. I mean, the first edition of Fellowship of the Ring has this whole preface that says, I found this book, and it's Bilbo was the translator, or I translated Bilbo rather, or Frodo. And also just, the way that Lord of the Rings is layered with history and different cultures and things. I mean, it does seem extremely apposite. The more you talk about it, the more kind of obvious it seems, but also I haven't thought of it like this before, so that's fantastic. Coley also asks a question about Carpenter's biography. So this is something that you mentioned, sort of a kind of wisdom that you're questioning, and so Humphrey Carpenter wrote the authorized biography of J.R.R. Tolkien, and that's where a lot of these ideas about Tolkien not being a reader of modern literature come from. He was only ever reading from the Middle Ages and that sort of thing. And Coley says, given that we have some reason for doubting the reliability of Carpenter's biography, which incidentally you build an excellent case for in this book, do you believe we need a new comprehensive biography to replace it? If so, what scholar would you want to write it? And maybe you. Could you do it?
Well,
that would be good.
That has become something that I have been thinking about, to be honest, because I do believe we do need a new biography. And I want to add that I started out this research assuming that Humphrey Carpenter's biography was excellent, because it's the authorized biography, of course. I assumed it was correct. It was only about 5 years in, when I had amassed this huge heap of authors, and I'm starting to really analyze it, that I said to myself, Carpenter says in the biography, Tolkien read very little modern fiction and took no serious notice of it. And I looked at my research and I said, well, that's simply factually incorrect. It's not the case. So then that sparked, it's one of the reasons this book took a long time to write, because I wanted to find out, where did this come from? How did Carpenter come up with this idea? Why has it been accepted? And that's something I worked through in the first and last chapters of the book. But I started out assuming that it was fine, and then realizing, yeah, no, there's a lot of really serious issues with Carpenter's perspective. It's authorized almost by accident. It's was not a really planned and carefully, vetted biography. So yes, we do need a new one. I certainly think of the existing work, John Garth's work on Tolkien's Great War experiences in Tolkien and the Great War. I mean, that's just magisterial, and was really influential for me as a scholar in seeing how to take a fresh look at the research. Because Garth just goes and looks at it fresh and does new research and presents a really fully orbed and textured view of Tolkien, his early years, his involvement with the Great War, where we see that Tolkien was very much engaged with this modern event that is very influential for his writing. So that definitely is one I would point readers toward. It's not a complete biography, but it's certainly fantastic for that section of his life. And yes, I'm minded to do some biographical writing for myself, next decade or so.
Fantastic, yeah. I look forward to that, and I agree, we need more biographies. So Kate, and we've got loads of questions coming in, so thank you so much. So I'll ask a few more, and then I'll hand back to you, Sara, and then I'll come back to the audience questions. Kate asks a question. Actually, this is one of the questions Sara and I were thinking of as well, which is, do you have a biggest surprise? Because it sounds like in writing this book, there are lots of surprises. The book itself was almost a surprise in the argument that emerged. Was there like a big surprise, a moment when you thought, oh, wow, I had no idea Tolkien would have read that?
It was a lot of little surprises building up. And after I had gotten a certain way into it, I began to expect these surprises in a way, just to say, oh, he really read more than I thought, so let me be prepared for these surprises. Some of the little ones, I was really delighted to turn up. I don't think anyone has noted this before, that he enjoyed the poetry of Dylan Thomas. Who knew? I didn't know. George Sayre remarks on this, that Tolkien had praised the poetry of Dylan Thomas to him. Wow. Okay, good to know. So that was surprised. I had not heard that before. And probably a somewhat larger scale surprise is Tolkien's engagement with science fiction, because he really had a much more enthusiastic view of science fiction and a much wider reading of it than I thought. I mean, I knew he knew some of the authors, but it wasn't until I did more of the sustained research and saw what sorts of things he talked about, that he spoke very highly of the field. He was knowledgeable about American science fiction. And I was surprised to discover that he was familiar with American science fiction magazines. And again, this was a little detail, but this did surprise me. One of the things I tried to do in my research was to pay really careful attention to chronology, because that's something that has sometimes gotten blurred. Tolkien lived a long life, and people tend to sometimes mush up all of the events, together. But there's a point where he mentions, he uses the word robot in his essay on fairy stories, and we take that for granted now. Robot, perfectly common word, but it was a neologism in his day. So I tracked down, when did he use this, and what was the usage of robot up to that time? And it was very little used, and he certainly got it from the American science fiction magazines. And then in the Notion Club papers, he has one of his characters use the phrase scientifiction instead of science fiction. And that's a very, very short-lived early description of what would then be called science fiction that came from editor of an American science fiction magazine. So there were a couple little word choice clues that by looking at the date, I was able to really realize that he knew the American science fiction magazines, and he refers to them elsewhere. He knew them quite well, enough to just sort of discourse knowledgeably on them. I found that quite surprising. It fit into the larger picture once I had all the details, but it was one of the things that surprised me. And also along those lines, it very much surprised me to discover how nuanced his views on technology were. Stuart Lee's
Right.
discovery of the lost footage of the BBC interview with him. Wow, that great piece of research there by Lee.
Yeah.
And to discover that the interviewer asks him what he thinks is a leading question, inviting him to basically rubbish industry and cars. And Tolkien, in a very measured way, says, well, factories depends on their size. Some are good, some are bad. Cars, love riding in them, like driving them. Problem is the road makers who blast through all the scenery. Very nuanced. And it's interesting because, the view of Tolkien is anti-modern. A lot of that blame comes from Carpenter. But Carpenter, in a sense, crystallizes and solidifies certain tendencies that were already there. Because even in Tolkien's lifetime, people were trying to cast him in a stereotypical anti-modern, anti-technology, nostalgic way. And Tolkien resists it. Like in this interview, so no, I like driving cars. Cars are great. Just road makers are making a mess. Or another interviewer who says, who again gives him kind of a leading question, assuming that he doesn't pay any attention to the news. And Tolkien says, oh no, in fact, I take 3 newspapers. I'm very interested in local news and national news and international news. And I was able to see, especially in looking at Warren Lewis's diary, which records, conversations he had with Tolkien. Tolkien was consistently very interested in current events. So again, we have this tendency to assume that he must be ignorant and dismissive of modern events because he must be, right? Because he fits. It allows the reader or the interviewer to put him into a kind of a comfortable stereotype and avoid the fact that Tolkien is in fact challenging a lot of what we're thinking and causing us to think more deeply. But yeah, Tolkien had a much more nuanced view of technology. He was very vehement about the abuses of technology, about its totalitarian applications and power and the destruction of the environment. He's very against the abuse of technology, but nuanced about it. And I think that makes him even more of a challenging figure than he has been hitherto, because we can't just dismiss him as a Luddite crank. Not at all. He has very legitimate criticisms that I think we need to listen to.
Yeah, no, it's very, very easy to put authors into pigeonholes and so on. And just kind of following up from that, Matt asks, maybe you've already answered this actually, because he says he's asking about sci-fi magazines, but wanting more details. And he asks, any chance you read Weird Tales? I don't know if you've come across that one.
I didn't come across Weird Tales specifically. Amazing Stories, Astounding, those science fiction magazines. Those are the ones that he knew. Weird Tales, I don't know specifically. That didn't turn up. So I don't know.
And of course, he met Arthur C. Clarke in the Eastgate Hotel with C.S. Lewis. And if I had a time machine, I'd love to sit on the table next to that and just listen in.
A good time was had by all, apparently.
Yeah. We've also had a few questions about the same thing, which is about this other book, Alonzo Chili's book, Tolkien's Library, which does a different thing, but there's some overlap. And so people are curious about that book in relation to this book, because you have taken different approaches. So one of the things that I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right. I assume it's Chili, or because it's an Italian name, I think, but Cilli. One of the things that book does is include some of the things we assume that he did read, and you don't do that. But yeah, Constantine is asking about this. Is kind of curious. For example, Tolkien surely knew and even wrote a parody on him, Sherlock Holmes, but any particular book or story is unknown. Constantine also asks, did Tolkien read any Agatha Christie books besides At Bertram's Hotel, which was a gift to his wife? So it's like a few things that we kind of think, surely he read more. What do we do with that category, and how does your approach differ to Alonzo's Chili's?
Yeah, it's a tough question. And I opted for rigor. That we needed to know that he read something. So for instance, from anecdotal evidence from his children, it seems clear that he did indeed read Bertram's Hotel. It wasn't just his wife's book. And there's other evidence. He praises Agatha Christie. We know that he loved Agatha Christie. That's the only one title that I was able to find evidence of, but he speaks highly of her in general. Surely, obviously, he read multiple books. I spoke with Walter Hooper, and he remembered visiting Tolkien in the hospital, and Tolkien was reading an Agatha Christie book. Walter, obviously, at these passage of decades, couldn't recall what the title was, but, so we know that he read other Agatha Christie books. What the titles were, I don't know. We know that he read, some Conan Doyle. Had he read Sherlock Holmes? Surely he did. I don't have that evidence, so I didn't put it in there. And I think, I think that Chili's book is not as useful as it could be. I regret the approach that he took, because I think that it has a great deal of useful matter in it. I do draw on it for some points, especially for books that Tolkien owned. It's useful for that, but I find that it's not nearly as useful as it could have been, because he doesn't distinguish the probables from the certains. Right. And one of the big issues for me, where I disagree with the method, is that he includes those books that are used as illustrations in quotations that Tolkien worked on for the Oxford English Dictionary. And I looked into this really, really carefully, because it's so tempting. Look, all these books, but looking at the process by which the entries were made, it became absolutely clear to me that in the editorial process, the selection and choosing of illustrative quotations was totally separate from the etymological work. They didn't connect. They were done on different times, different schedules, different people, different points in the process. So just because they happened eventually to appear in the same entry that Tolkien worked on tells us nothing. We don't have any evidence. It's a zero. It's a no evidence one way or the other. And I think that including those in a list of Tolkien's reading confuses the issue in an unhelpful way. So I wish that those had been omitted, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can see that, it's such a powerful thing when you can say for certain that Tolkien read that particular book, but also, as you say, there's just knowing that he read an Agatha Christie tells you so much, right? That he was reading that kind of work. And then you kind of think, well, actually, why not? Why wouldn't, and then you kind of question a lot of things. There's, just to tell everyone in the audience, there's this, one of my favorite parts of this book, just because it's so useful. It's this wonderful appendix where you actually list through everything, and you also say where this from, where your evidence is from. So it's incredibly useful, and it's really long, and there's so many interesting things here. I'll ask just another kind of couple of questions from the audience before I hand back to Sara, and then I'll come back to the questions, because there's a few more that I haven't asked yet, but I'm kind of wanting to rest my voice. Una asks a couple of specific questions. You touch on T.S. Eliot in the book, 4 quartets in particular. Do we know if you read The Wasteland?
We don't know. If I had known, I would have put it in. So this actually is a good thing. Once you read Tolkien's Modern Reading, if I don't mention the title, it means at this point we don't know. Right. Because if I knew it, I put it in. But we don't know that he read The Wasteland. We do know his familiarity with Eliot. It would be very interesting to know. And I think that this is a case of our assumptions is, in a way, maybe hinders our research, because people have conflated him with C.S. Lewis, who was rubbished Eliot's poetry, quite unfairly, really. He didn't quite get what Eliot was doing, I don't think. So I think people have, and this has been a flaw, people have tended to conflate Lewis and Tolkien in their views, which they overlap by a lot, but they're distinct in many quite interesting ways. And people have assumed that because Lewis totally dismissed Eliot, that so did Tolkien. But the little bits that I've been able to find about Tolkien's view on Eliot are cautiously positive. Especially I thought his being sad at the news of Eliot's death. And he's disparaging of the memorial verse that Masefield wrote for Eliot. And the verse is dreadful. It's just the saccharine, trite, awful bit of verse, totally inappropriate for Eliot, the modernist. And the fact that Tolkien criticized it tells me that he cared about Eliot and that he understood Eliot's, work enough to know that it's just completely off tone. But we don't know anymore. And I wonder in a way if part of why we don't know more is that people have assumed that he didn't like Eliot, and so they haven't looked. It's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of what people report about Tolkien that has been going on, for decades, for Tolkien's entire life, really, that you have to kind of push against and say, no, not the stereotype, not the pigeonhole. What did he really think? And Eliot, I think, is possibly one of the casualties of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Una asks a follow-up question. I'm also curious about whether Tolkien read the war poets, Sassoon, Owen, etc. That would be fascinating to know.
Yeah, I don't have really much on those. I know that he knew some of them, especially his friend Graves, Bridges, for instance. But I don't have anything, for instance, of Sassoon or Graves, or Owen, for that matter. I think it would be very interesting to know if he did. Personally, I think he probably did know them, but I don't have evidence that he did, and so I don't talk about it.
Yeah, and you mentioned John Garth before, his book that, and there's also a Signum Course all about this, by the way, when we read Owen and Sassoon and we read at the same time what Tolkien was writing, and it's really fascinating to see them in conversation with each other. And of course, Wilfred Owen wrote a poem about King Arthur. That wasn't, we're talking about pigeonholing Tolkien, but people pigeonhole everyone, right? They write about, they say, oh, well, Owen was so disenchanted and Tolkien was enchanted, and it's not necessarily, that's not the whole picture. So yeah, that's, as you say, it's like more work to be done, but I mean, amazing to kind of open our eyes to all of this.
And that really is one thing I just want to add. I hope that people will take this as an invitation to look at these things, more seriously, and say, well, yeah, let's do exactly as you do in that course, which is brilliant. Put him against his contemporaries and put them in dialogue. There's so much interesting work just waiting to be done. And in many ways, as I was putting together Tolkien's Modern Reading, I thought, I want this book to encourage people to do that. And it's one of the reasons why the bibliography it's 14 pages long. Here, read, go do more things, ask these questions, carry on, please. I want to see it.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I'm going to hand back to you, Sara, but there are some more questions. So what I'll be doing whilst you're asking a question, Sara, is I'll be sorting through and making sure I haven't missed anything, and we'll try to get through all the audience questions before the end of the hour.
Cool, excellent. Okay, so with all of these wonderful modern authors that we know that Tolkien read, we can say, okay, we can start having conversations about how the works of those authors may have influenced Tolkien in what he wrote. But you make a really interesting point in your book about what you call negative influence. And I wondered if you'd like to talk a little bit about what you mean by negative influence and how we could work with that in our scholarly reading of Tolkien.
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic, because the question of sources and influences is a little bit difficult. And I was faced in trying to do my analysis with trying to consider Tolkien's own view of these things. Now, we don't have to abide by what authors say that is a good thing to do with their work. We need to make our own judgments. But Tolkien criticizes shallow source study. And rightly so. And there is a kind of source study that is reductive. And the kind of source study that and other Tolkien scholars have, again, correctly criticized, there's Gollum, there's Gagul from, Haggard. Oh, beautiful, we figured something out. Well, until you ask, why does that matter? Why should we care? You haven't really gotten anywhere. So there was that question about sources, and also tracing out the difference between sources and influences, because they're not quite the same thing. A source, Lewis gives you this vocabulary, a source kind of gives you an idea, gives you a scene or a character or something. And there are things that Tolkien names as sources, and then there's influence that shapes maybe how you do things or gives you ideas. But then as I was doing this work, I found that even that nuance didn't quite cover all the ways that I saw him interacting with his material. And one of those was what I called, what you call negative influence by opposition, where he sees something that's being done and he doesn't like it, and so he does something else or he does it differently. And I think this to me seemed very important, because a lot of people have tended to assume that if Tolkien didn't like something, that he didn't care about it, like, oh, write it off. Well, Tolkien didn't like a lot of things because he had extraordinarily high standards. And he had extraordinarily high standards for his own writing. I mean, he goes back and he calls his own book, The Hobbit, a rabble, because he's a bit unhappy with his own mix of mythologies. So his own high standards apply to his own work, to everything. So he's very critical of, some of the works that he reads. But I realize that doesn't mean that they're not relevant. Quite the contrary. In many, many cases, he reacts negatively to something and then turns around and does it better, does it differently. And the sort of case in point is George MacDonald's The Golden Key, which he loved early. Very interesting. His relationship with MacDonald is extraordinarily complex, because he greatly admired him at one point, calls it an almost perfect tale, and then decades later returns to it and hates it, just can't stand it.
Yeah.
Again, we have to realize Tolkien's tastes changed. All of our tastes change over long life. But this is very dramatic. And he's so irritated by it that he ends up writing Smith of Wotton Major. And he describes, he himself actually says that this was an influence by opposition, that this was the grit that produced the pearl. And he says that it often happens that way. And I thought that was really insightful. As is often the case, he says, the irritant produces the work. And I thought, he's speaking about an aspect of his creative imagination that we haven't paid enough attention to. And so a lot of it, like looking at what does he say that he dislikes? Well, if he takes the time to express his dislike of it, he cares about it, he's engaging with it. And so I found, for instance, looking at his reaction to Charles Williams really interesting. Because well known that he didn't like Tolkien. Tolkien didn't like Williams's spiritual thrillers, and he hated his poetry. And I have to admit, I'm kind of with Tolkien in that one. I'm not a fan of Williams's poetry. I think it's impenetrable. But be that as it may, it's Tolkien really didn't like the novels, didn't like the poetry. And since those are the works of Williams's that are now reprinted, people have very easily drawn the conclusion that he disliked everything that Williams wrote, to court. But in fact, Williams wrote loads of things, very prolific, most of which have not been reprinted. And Tolkien sort of praises in general terms his plays, his other writings, his reviews, and even makes a positive remark about one of the plays in particular, The House of the Octopus. And so again, this is interesting. Like, it's not just Williams in general, it's these novels and this poetry. Well, what is it about them that he doesn't like? And then in looking at what makes Williams's novels different from Tolkien's, and Tolkien read a number of Williams's novels, and you don't do that if you find them worthless, right? He didn't like them, but he kept reading them. And so clearly he found something engaging in them that he then reacts against. And I think there's a lot more that could be explored in that area. I mean, I tentatively think that it had to do with the way that Williams does the supernatural in his fiction, which is not at all the way that Tolkien does it. And I do suspect that Williams, who was a member of the Inklings, who got to know Tolkien, lots of interaction there, I really do think that seeing the way that Williams handled the supernatural and saying, I don't like that, I suspect that it helped Tolkien to shape his own approach, to say, but I want to do it this other way, clarifying the way that he wanted to do it. So I think influence by opposition, it's difficult to trace, but it can be very powerful. And again, in order to do influence by opposition, you've got to really know for sure what he read, because you know, you can't just say, well, he probably read that and didn't like it. You got to know. But if you know, then it's possible to kind of tease out some more complex threads of his responses.
Right, because if you know that he read text X, you know that for certain, and text X deals with this particular theme, and then Tolkien deals with that theme in a completely different way. That, of course, is how you tease out those nuances, isn't it?
It is, especially if you look at the patterns. You know, what did he read in that genre? How did he relate to that author's work in general? And it really gives you a much more three-dimensional look at his creative process.
Right, because we tend to think of inspiration in a sort of more kind of positive way, and oh, what inspired him? He loved this so much, he was inspired to do. We don't necessarily go straight to the idea of he read this but was inspired to do that sort of thing in a totally different way.
Yeah.
And yet one of the most famous accounts is putting it right in front of us, the famous so-called wager with Lewis. Why it's called the wager, there was no bet involved there. Anyway, this wager with Lewis, where they're looking at, you know, the science fiction. Well, there's none of the, you know, the sorts of books that we like to read. We have to write them ourselves, and then they toss up, and Lewis gets space travel, Tolkien gets time travel. So everyone quite naturally is interested in what they do with those. You know, Lewis's becomes Out of the Silent Planet, which Tolkien loved and helped to get published, which is just, I think, worth stating. And Tolkien's time travel, which of course he didn't finish because Tolkien, people get caught up in that. But I stopped back, like, wait a second, in order to say there's not enough of what we like being published, they had to know the field, and they had to love the field, because you don't keep reading in a topic that you don't care about. You just don't read it. But they kept reading, Tolkien kept reading science fiction because it was a genre that he enjoyed, that he found fruitful, that he found exciting, and his incredibly high expectations are unmet. So he says, I have to do it myself. You know, and again, it's a more complex picture than just, I loved it, I want to imitate it.
Back to Gabriel, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say Diana Gleyer's work on the Inklings as well as also sort of fits into that argument, and we forget, you know, the Inklings weren't just 3 or 4 people. It was a quite a big group of diverse opinions, as diverse as you can be when you're all male. But certainly, you know, they're back and forth. So we've got loads of questions. So we'll try to get through them all. Adam asks, is there a modern author and or genre that you would say is top of the heap of influences, or is there an author genre he apparently enjoyed deeply without it being a discernible influence on his own writing, something he enjoyed for its own sake?
I'm not quite sure I even know really how to answer that question, to be honest. And I think in terms of top of the heap, it's in a way difficult because I'm working with the evidence that we have, and the evidence that we have is partial and influenced by the selection biases of Carpenter and others. So we've got a lot of evidence for his reading of children's literature. I've got multiple chapters on it. So I think we could sort of tentatively say that children's literature certainly was a particularly important influence for him, and it did show that he was interested in it from his own childhood, also his children, also his grandchildren. He kept up with it, and he had it as an academic interest. So children's literature was quite significant in terms of influence and in sort of shaping what he was doing, how he was doing it. Whether it was more than other areas is difficult really to make that kind of judgment, I would say.
And presumably there's loads of books that he read just for pleasure. Like, I mean, I don't think Agatha Christie ended up in Lord of the Rings necessarily, or who knows, maybe someone could make that case.
Well, that's something I think is worth emphasizing. It's a very good point, Gabriel, because what I was trying to do is look at everything, and not everything then leads to a source study or an influence argument. And and some of my arguments I think are very solid. Others are more speculative. And I try to indicate that, like maybe, possibly, but there's a lot of authors that I just name and say he read these. And I think that helps our understanding of him as well, because the fact that Tolkien was a reader of mystery novels just tells us something about his imagination. I doubt that it had any influence whatsoever on his writing, but you know, Agatha Christie wrote her novels, their plot set in her present day, contemporary day. He's reading contemporary fiction that's dealing with contemporary issues. It shows his engagement with these issues, and that does end up being part of the influence for his work. So in a kind of indirect way, it's really useful to see just what does he read for pleasure, Agatha Christie, you know, that sort of thing. And that gives us the bigger context to be able to make more of those judgments about influence and things like that.
Definitely. And there's a kind of related question to current affairs. Kate asks, did you look at his newspaper reading habits, such as subscription? So like you mentioned that he read 3 newspapers a day. Is that right? Or
well, he took 3 newspapers a day.
Oh, okay. Do you know what they were?
I do. I could look it up.
Okay, so but it's in the book.
Yes.
Okay, so Kate, look it up, and that's another reason to buy the book to get that answer. I was thinking in the Bodleian exhibition, you have his doodles on newspapers, so we know that for sure. He read those newspapers, or at least doodled on them. But yeah, that's a fascinating thing. You don't think about Tolkien reading newspapers, but then again, why don't you? So yeah.
Well, I think part of the reason we don't is because C.S. Lewis vehemently didn't.
Right.
And Lewis is actually, you know, newspapers are full of, you know, lies and nonsense, and he very deliberately doesn't read them and says, he says somewhere, if there's anything important, one of my friends will tell me. And so that, I think, is one of the reasons why we've assumed, like, you know, Lewis and Tolkien, therefore Tolkien doesn't read newspapers, and Carpenter says that he doesn't. In a passage which I think is heavily influenced by a passage about Lewis, very heavily
interesting. And Constant, sorry, go ahead.
But I think once we separate the two, we can see that, yeah, Tolkien really was very interested in the news, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was the friend that Lewis had in mind, about the friend who would tell him if there was anything going on, because here's Tolkien with the 3 newspapers. Surely if there's something, he'll tell his friend Jack.
And Constantine says it's the Times, an Oxford local newspaper, and he can't remember the third, but it's in the book. So Kate, you can look that up. Okay. So Scott says, with regards to Newman's writings, have you looked at what he could have been exposed to at St. Philip's Grammar School and later liturgically serving at Father Francis's private masses? That is, what was used liturgically or scholastically at the oratory?
Yes. And I haven't got anything that I could put forward.
Okay.
You know, one thing I can be sure that he would have heard hymns that Tolkien, that Newman had written, because those were sung. But I didn't feel that I wasn't able to determine closely enough, like what hymns and, you know, which ones were Newman's versus other ones in the oratory and hymn book. It didn't quite rise to my level of detail. But yes, I did look at those things, and as yet have not turned up anything specific about Newman. If people do turn things up, please let me know. I would be very keen to know.
For the second
Fantastic.
edition.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Una's suggesting maybe a Catholic newspaper like the Catholic Herald would have been something that Tolkien would have subscribed to. I don't know if you came across that.
Yes, I've actually done a full search of all the Catholic Herald's archives, and which are now electronically archived, and I've looked at them also in the Bodleian. So I do draw on the Catholic Herald materials for what I've got, but nothing that tells me what he read of Newman's.
Not yet anyway. Okay, well that's good to know. And Kate confirms the book is sitting on my to be read pile. So Kate has a copy, just hasn't got through it yet. That's fair enough. And then there's a few questions kind of about, did Tolkien read this person? And so it really shows the enthusiasm and excitement of the audience. But I'm going to put you on the spot with a few of them, but you can just let us know if it's in the book, and then people can look it up. But so Stephen asks Nabokov, if you read Nabokov. We don't know, or no evidence. Okay, excellent. Collie asks, did you find that he was a reader or rereader of any of the lives of the saints?
I didn't look into that because my focus was fiction.
Right.
I am stay tuned because I'm actually working on a new Tolkien book, which that sort of thing will come into it. So yeah, watch this space a couple of years time. Right. But so that is a question that I'm sure that he did. I have not yet looked at that question.
Okay, excellent. Eileen says, as I'm not familiar with John Buchan and his book Green Mantle, would you give a brief description of this book and how it influenced Tolkien?
That's really difficult to do in a capsule. It's sort of action adventure with a little bit of a mystical twist. It's set in the First World War, in fact, overlapping with it, and it's really impossible to give a quick summary of the plot. And I would not say that it influenced Tolkien, but I think that his reading of it tells us some interesting things about his preferences and his views about heroism, because Richard Hannay, the hero, is an active hero, but also a very moral one, and he is never despairing. And I think this is a really interesting line of thought, because in Tolkien's medieval reading, the sagas are full of despairing heroes, lots of murder suicides and things like that. And Hannay is a non-despairing hero, even when in tight circumstances. And it's quite interesting to pair that with Tolkien's critique of the sort of mystique of the hero that he makes in line with Haggard's Eric Bright Eyes. So it helps us to see that, kind of look at Tolkien's portrayal of heroes like Aragorn with kind of a fresh eye, because Aragorn is really more complex as a character than I think we sometimes give him credit for. He has doubts. He's not sure what he's supposed to do at times. He considers himself to be a failure because he seems to be making bad decisions. Should I chase after Pippin and Merry, or should I go after Frodo? And everything I decide seems to go wrong. He's not the all-knowing, super competent, all the time figure that we might stereotype him as. So in that sense, he's much more modern than we realize, but he's not despairing. And the interesting thing is that the lack of despair is actually Tolkien revising his medieval material, because it would be much more consistent with some of the sagas for, Aragorn to fall into a black depression and, die. So Aragorn is just much more complex, and I think the Buchan's Richard Hannay gives us kind of a little bit of a side angle of like the kinds of things that might have given Tolkien some models on thinking about how to do that.
Fantastic. And there's one question left. There's a few questions that we've sort of already touched on, so I'm going to move past those because we're coming to the end of our time. So apologies if I didn't ask your specific question, but I think you'll find the answers in this book anyway if you haven't looked at it already. But Catherine asks a question that we haven't touched on really about Tolkien's friends. Catherine says, was it possible to learn the degree to which there was interchange between different fields in his professional life? Did he have other friends beyond the Inklings?
Oh, what a good question. Yes, this is very interesting. And in terms of my argument, I focused on his reading, not his relationships. So I couldn't go into that really in depth. But a book that was really helpful and influential for me was, in fact, Diana Gleyer's The Company They Keep, which you alluded to before. Brilliant book. Really just, again, challenges Carpenter and shows that the Inklings did influence each other. They did interact. They did collaborate. Highly recommended. So we know that he had these interactions. One of the things that surprised me as I did my research was just realizing how sociable Tolkien was. He was an extraordinarily busy man. He had 4 children. He had an extremely busy professional life, much more than Carpenter, I think, shows that he did. Raymond Edwards' biography, Tolkien, although not perfect, is very good on Tolkien's academic work. I think gets it more, provides a better context than other biographers do. So his is a very busy life, and yet he's always socializing with his students. Many of his former students became then family friends, and it's one of the things that struck me is that he had many women friends. And this is something I didn't expect, because the stereotype has been, oh, Tolkien and his Inklings buddies in their little male-only world. Not the case. You know, he was married, unlike some of the Inklings. He had a daughter, granddaughter. He very consciously spent time with them. I mean, the letters, you know, Joanna Tolkien's recollections of her grandfather are of a you know, a deep relationship, of a constant care and interest in her. He gave her books. He, you know, helped guide her education. A really strong interest. He had many female friends amongst the English faculty. He names some specific ones who are old friends. We don't know much about them, again, in part because people haven't looked at this material, because they've assumed that Tolkien hated women, therefore there's nothing to look at, move on. There were a couple of women from his teaching at Leeds that he helped to get jobs at the Oxford English Dictionary, going out of his way to provide special training for them so they would be able to get the jobs. So he's looking after his female students. Simone Dardenne was a student of his at Oxford who became a close family friend. And one particularly interesting little tidbit was there's an Oxford club called The Cave that he co-founded for Oxford faculty. Carpenter lists only male members, and every biographer since Carpenter has just picked up his list. So I had assumed it was a male-only club like the Inklings. It wasn't. It was a co-ed club from the beginning, and it had loads of female members, including some of his English faculty women professor friends. So he actually had a really co-ed, genuinely collegial and friendly relationships with a lot of women, much more so than, you know, for instance, C.S. Lewis, who had limited friendships with women. So this is an area where I think Tolkien's friendships is well worth some, frankly, some fresh research, because just the little tidbits I turned up showed we've been just looking at this with, again, with assumptions and not seeing, like, look at all these women that he's genuinely friends with and you know, collegial with.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we're coming to the end of our time, aren't we, Gabriel?
Yes, yeah, we could go on. I mean, I could just listen to you all day, Holly. It's fascinating to hear you talk, and I've really enjoyed reading this book.
Yeah.
Una says that was great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Holly, for coming. And yes, for more information, please see her published works.
Yes, and Una also says I would love to read a biography by you. So
yeah, definitely. So, you know, get on that. That'd be great. Thank you.
I'll see what I can do.
Excellent. So thank you once again for joining us, Holly. This has been so informative and so interesting. And as Gabriel said, I love your book. I think it's great because it gives this fresh new perspective that we've been crying out for, and that it does really shine a light on a lot of the limitations of the Carpenter biography that I think are really important that we actually acknowledge in the scholarly world. And even for those who are Tolkien readers who aren't necessarily scholars, it's important to, I think, understand that there are some huge limitations to what has up till now been accepted as the biography. So that's been also really revelatory. But thank you for giving us your time. Thank you for sharing with us. It's been absolutely wonderful to talk to you.
Well, my pleasure.
Thank you very much, everyone, and bye-bye.